Thanks, Ceann Comhairle. Minister, this follows on obviously from a number of parliamentary questions from a number of deputies, and indeed your meeting with individuals in the Action Lariam campaign, and it's really in light of the fact that the rest of the world is moving and rowing back on the use of Lariam. We know it's been completely abandoned in the UK, and in America is only used in the Defence Forces as the third choice, and only if the other options are not suitable, as a very much last resort. So I'm wondering why then, against all international best practice, are you saying that it's still the policy of the Irish Defence Forces to prescribe Lariam as the first drug of choice?
Minister.
Okay, well, first of all, we don't prescribe Lariam as the first drug of choice. We look at a region and then we take the best possible medical advice as to what the most appropriate drug is for that region. Depending on how long people are going to stay, the strain of malaria in that region. And so it's also not true to say that the UK and the US have abandoned Lariam. They haven't, actually. They do use Lariam, but only in certain circumstances. And of course they have screening processes and information processes to ensure that they do everything they can to manage the risk in relation to the use of Lariam. And of course we are trying to do the same. But Deputy, I have to, and by the way, I had a very good meeting with the group advocating for a change of policy in relation to the use of Lariam. As you would expect, it was a very emotive meeting, as well as a very blunt one. And that group have sent me in writing a series of questions which we'll respond to. And I'm having my department and the Defence Forces look at those questions in some detail to try and get responses to those questions. But I have a working group that is made up of international and Irish experts to make recommendations to me as to the best course of action on Lariam. And I think that it would be irresponsible of me to make decisions in advance of getting that up-to-date report. And so what I propose to do, we had hoped to get that report by the end of January. The group have asked for a bit more time, and we'll obviously give them some more time. But I mean, I think I've said this to you before, Deputy, and I hope you'll take me on my word at it. I have an open mind here to trying to do what's best. I'm not going to make decisions on Lariam on the basis of court cases or anything like that. My only issue here is to do what's best for Irish soldiers who are serving in areas where Lariam is a problem. Where malaria is a problem. There are effectively 3 malaria drugs that I'm aware of anyway, and you know the medical advice that's available to me and to the Defence Forces will determine what drug is prescribed for the Defence Force personnel that are going to different regions.
Thank you.
If the expert group recommend that we change policy, I'll be the first to make it happen.
Yeah, the problem, Minister, is that best national and international practice, which you never quote the source for your advice, but it would tell you that Lariam should be last resort. Now, I didn't say that the Americans didn't use it. I specifically said it was a last resort after the other 2. No, you said they'd abandoned it. I talked about Britain. I said in terms of America, which is what the question is about. And we're talking, let's be clear, about Sub-Saharan Africa. That's where we're talking about it. And the Irish Defence Forces policy is that you prefer Lariam. That's all I'm talking about, is Sub-Saharan Africa. And the United States Defence Forces do not have that policy. And it is not the case that it's the most suitable drug for that area. So it is your stated policy, and it is against best practice. Now, what the people who met you want to know is why it is the case that, given that the manufacturer of Lariam themselves say it should only be taken after very serious analysis of a person's predisposition or with a very, very clear warning, and that's the only circumstances in which it's allowed in the rare examples in America. Why in Ireland we have a different view of that process? We're completely exposing people to danger, because it's not just about whether people have a predisposition or pre-problems. You can't say with certainty that an individual assessment has taken taken place of every Defence Force personnel who was given Lariam. And that's the only basis upon which the manufacturer says it should be given, because of the dangers, undisputed dangers, linked with that product. And I hear what you're saying, that you don't have a fixed view, but the problem with that is we've been hearing that. And meanwhile, albeit in smaller doses, Lariam is continuing to be prescribed. But I'll come back at you on a question on that.
Minister. Well, I mean, first of all, we don't have large numbers of Defence Force personnel in Sub-Saharan Africa at the moment. But that actually isn't so much the point, because the point is if the recommendation is that Lariam is the most appropriate drug for a region that we're sending Defence Force personnel to, well, then of course there's a screening process. And I have had long and detailed meetings with the Defence Forces and the Department of Defence on this issue to get an understanding of those screening processes, in terms of ensuring that that people are suitable to actually use and take Lariam to protect them against malaria. Like, that is as it is at the moment. If the expert working group that we've asked to report to us on this comes back and suggests, because of the so-called international best practice that you're talking about, which doesn't reflect medical best practice on the basis of what we're making decisions on, given the advice that I have, and the Irish Defence Force policy in relation to the use of anti-malarial medication, which is in line with current Health Products Regulatory Authority approval, summary of product characteristics, which is basically a technical way of saying it is consistent with the medical advice related to those products. We will continue to try and do what is in the best interest of our Defence Force personnel.
Thank you.
If the working group recommends something different, well, then I will be the first to make the change immediately. But I have to wait until I get that report, rather than making a change on the basis of what some other country somewhere else is doing. The reason why we have a working
Deputy Daly, no, I'm sorry, Minister. Come back to the Minister. Deputy Daly, I call.
You've acknowledged, Minister, that the working group hasn't issued its findings and there hasn't been a change in policy. You might explain to me then how in two different PQs that I put to you recently, in one of them you told me that the overwhelming majority of personnel in Sub-Saharan Africa were prescribed Lariam between 2010 and 2015. But when I asked the question specifically about 2015, I was told that 25% of Defence Forces personnel were not prescribed Lariam. So that's clearly a differential. It means less people are being prescribed Lariam now than were over the last number of years in that region, which I welcome. But could you explain to me then how, if the policy is unchanged, the discrepancies in the amount of people who are being prescribed that, and again you fail to answer how there can be an assurance that every individual personnel member had an individual assessment, when the evidence that's been given to you in some instances would say the opposite, that their files were not assessed, they were not asked the appropriate questions, and that they weren't given the proper warnings.
Thank you. Minister, to conclude.
Well, I mean, I can only answer from the evidence that I've seen, which is that the current screening process is a robust one, that individual soldiers have to fill out individual forms before they go in relation to Lariam. In relation to Sub-Saharan Africa, when we had a lot more troops there, it was quite a different situation, because we had troops on rotation maybe for 6 months. You know, over the last number of years, we may well send down troops for a shorter period of time. The numbers are much less. So, for example, I went to Mali last year, and I took anti-malarial medication, but I was only there for 2 days. So Lariam wasn't the appropriate drug. So yet previously I've been to Sub-Saharan Africa for a longer period, and I took Lariam. So depending on how long you stay, some drugs you take on a daily basis, some you take on a weekly basis, and therefore you manage risk differently.
Thank you.
So just to repeat again, right? Because the meeting I had with families that feel that they have been very seriously affected by Lariam. I take this issue hugely seriously, and I have a lot of sympathy for people who are struggling
Thank you. I've gone on to the next question. We're way over time. Deputy Robert Troy, the next question.
But on the basis of expert advice.
Deputy Robert Troy, I'm sorry we're waiting for a long time.